Thank you very much, and good morning. Come on in and take a seat. I assume many, or if not most of you, were in the previous session where you were sort of getting some of the technical details about 5G. Now, this is the panel we're going to talk about where the rubber meets the road, or where the money hits the road, more to the point, and some of the more interesting aspects of the use cases for it. I've got a very distinguished group of panelists. To my immediate left, I have Scott Belcher, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Telecommunications Industry Association. And I was happy to attend their most recent annual, it was your annual conference earlier in the summer in Dallas, right? Dallas?
Yep.
Okay. We're going to talk about that. And Scott was previously President and CEO of the Intelligent Transportation Society of the Americas, so we can talk a little about transport too, right? Next to Scott is Tejas Rowe, who's Managing Director with Accenture's Communications, Media, and High-Tech Network Practice, and he leads the mobile offering, capabilities, sales, and business development activities for North America. Thank you very much for joining us. And then last but not least is Brian Hendricks, who's the Head of Technology, Policy, and Public Affairs for Nokia in the Americas region, which includes North America and Latin America. So let's just get, I think, just to get it started and get everybody talking, we've been designed to sort of look at the economics, and that's really become, or will soon become, the critical question. So we heard a lot about the engineering behind this. Obviously, you got the sense, if this was the first time you heard about it, this is going to be a very expensive undertaking. And of course, money does not grow on trees, especially not these days, and especially not in Wall Street. So we want to talk about some of the ways in which carriers and device and equipment manufacturers and network providers and infrastructure providers are going to be able to make the case to deploy 5G in the time frame that the technology, at least, will make possible. Let me start by asking each of you, we'll just go down the line here for this one, what do you think 5G means in terms of from your perspectives, from the infrastructure standpoint, from the network standpoint, from the equipment standpoint? What is 5G? Do we have actually a single usable definition for it?
I don't think so. I think what we're seeing is some really interesting innovative technology going on with companies like Samsung and Ericsson and Nokia. I mean, I think we're really looking into it. I think for me, what 5G is actually going to be a mashup of existing and new technologies. So you're going to have Wi-Fi. You're going to have other types of technologies that on multiple bandwidths. You're going to be using cognitive radio. You're going to be really, I think leveraging everything that we know today, plus more.
Okay. So, Tejas, how much of it is yet to be defined?
I mean, there's a lot still being worked on. I think the way we look at it is, I mean, we've all heard the stats, right? Whether you look at the scaling factor on sites, the response time, latency, so all of those kind of metrics are all there in terms of the number of devices going 10x to 1,000x, 17 billion smartphones, as well as just the overall kind of fiber penetration in the backhaul. We heard that this morning in some of the keynotes. Those are kind of the prereqs required to kind of deploy 5G. The way I guess Accenture is looking at it is more, we think of it as a forcing function on transformation. We're already starting to see carriers looking at the cost structure and trying to make the business case work for 4G. And our primary efforts have been in trying to figure out how do we drive cost out of both digital network deployment and then try to identify kind of the end-to-end service experience and what level of analytics we can drive for digitization as well as automation, right? I mean, those are the two key factors in my mind. Whether you talk about a 5G business case or a 4G business case, we do fundamentally think that there needs to be a transformation that's going to drive the need for the investment and then the continued evolution to 5G.
So I want to come back to that, but just real quick, I want to make sure I caught this. So are you going to tell us in a moment that deploying 5G can actually save a carrier money?
I think it's an enabler in the sense that what they're doing on 4G is going to help them get to 5G. Okay. So I think the way we're looking at it is you have to build the building blocks today to be able to at least get to 5G. And so, what we're trying to help is drive that efficiency in both the network deployment and the operating model that's associated with wireless today.
Gotcha. Okay. Brian, what do you think?
So I don't think it's very easy to have a single overarching definition of 5G. In some respects, we found it's all things to all people.
Yeah.
I think we look backward at spending the last roughly 10 years talking about LTE technology and architectures which were driven by the need to provide a mobile broadband experience, data, video, and high-quality voice. The use cases that are beginning to emerge, machine communication, a tactile internet that's going to allow real-time feedback to people who are going to be operating machines for everything from robotics, for surgery, et cetera, require certain network architectures and capabilities that our current systems don't offer us. We're going to have massive expansion of machine-to-machine communication, which is going to have its low bandwidth, but tens of millions and billions of users. We're going to have very high bandwidth, relatively few user applications. And so we need an architecture and a system which is capable of delivering that. Obviously leveraging the legacy radio technologies that are out there, but employing some new radio technologies. But 5G is a system of systems, and I think that that's a very important way to conceptualize it. It will work with the previous generations of technology. In fact, it must, in order for the cost to line up, for there to be flexibility for the carriers to be able to deploy the solutions.
And so inside Nokia, where is the focus right now on 5G? What is Nokia's focus in this regard?
Well, I think it's driven by the need, as Tejas was talking about, to take costs out. It's to facilitate the deployment of smaller, less expensive infrastructure for densification that we'll need for big capacity gains. It's to support longer battery life, to get us towards near zero latency, which is really critical to a lot of the use cases that we're talking about, from remote surgery to autonomous driving vehicles. It's focusing on other ways to bring costs out of the business, including virtualizing much of the network, software-defined networking, ways that can leverage what you have and build upon it and draw costs out as much as possible, while at the same time integrating new radio technologies that will make these massive increases in capability.
And from an engineering standpoint, I mean, Nokia's doing all those things now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any one that's more focus point than others?
I mean, no, because I think they're all critically important. The technology roadmaps, the migration paths that our customers ask us for, and realize we have customers who start at very different places along the continuum. We have some who did not deploy LTE. We had some who have deployed but not evolved to LTE. We have some who have very robust LTE capabilities, and so designing a pathway that leverages existing assets looks differently for each of those carrier cases. And so we listen, and a lot of it is about delivering high value and taking costs out of the business.
Okay. So Tejas, let me come back to you. And let's talk about, and not so much use case, but the application. So in the previous panel, they were saying, it's not quite clear yet what is going to be the killer app that will make 5G inevitable and ubiquitous. Say a little about what you think that might be, and particularly if you could give us sort of a sense of, and we won't hold you to it, but what kind of time frame do you think some of these applications that will drive 5G, what are they and when are they coming?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the core set that everybody's pointing towards, right? It's the, when we look at vertical industries and automotive, transportation, health, retail, so take automotive, connected car, connected home, it's the IoT of devices. All of these things are starting to have some level of connectivity, and we know that the acceleration of that connectivity is going to continue at a faster pace. So, the expectation of the end consumer is already there in terms of social collaboration, media and entertainment consumption. So if you give any end user enough bandwidth to consume, as long as there's enough applications out there that are delivering that content, I think you're going to continue to see that usage. And we saw in this morning's keynote, the growth in data is incredible over the last 2-3 years. So, I don't think there's an app that we're looking for specifically. I don't think there's a killer app, but I think there's enough applications and enough innovation going on in the ecosystem that as the networks evolve in terms of both capacity, the number of devices being connected into the network, as well as the critical response times are there, I think the applications will be there, right?
Okay.
And I think it's going to be a chicken and egg in the sense of, I think applications are already there. They're waiting for the network to kind of get up.
But can you give us a sense of, which of these are closer and which of these are further away? If you can't put dates on them, autonomous vehicles close, microsurgery further away, where are we?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you can see, the investments going on in connected car and I think those are closer in terms of getting enabled than kind of more of the real time. I think where use cases that are farther out are going to require some of the 5G capabilities, which is going from 250 milliseconds response time today of latency down to, as you said, almost
than
zero,
one.
right? So any use case that requires that real-time response is, I believe, a lot farther away. Because if you look at LTE networks today, they give you the broadband capabilities to deliver video content and all the other collaboration capabilities, is as you move to more of the real-time environment is where I think we're farther away.
And what are those applications that need the very, very, very low latency?
I mean, I think it's going to be in
Transportation.
in healthcare, in infrastructure, sensors that are in transportation that require that sub-millisecond response to be able to do corrections, right?
So it's
Yeah, go ahead,
interesting
Scott.
right now. I mean, USDOT has put together a program on dedicated short-range communication with vehicles that talk to each other to prevent crashes. Big debate in the technical community about whether we should in fact be relying on that technology or just waiting for 5G, because the expectation is that the latency is going to be adequate to be able to do it. Yeah. But it has to be, it has to be sufficiently adequate to prevent a crash. And that's what's made DSRC, or dedicated short-range communications, so valuable in that scenario. But it's taken 10 or 15 years to get to where we are. And then if you think about rolling out that technology in the next fleet of vehicles, we're talking another 17 years. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of crazy if you know that 5G is, say 2020, and you're going to have that technology available, that you can use that and rely on it. And so it's really created quite a conundrum for automobile manufacturers. You've got some automobile manufacturers like General Motors that are rolling out vehicles with the DSRC radios in them. But quite frankly, they're starting to roll out automobiles with multiple radios in them. And I think that even if we do see DSRC coming out, it too will become part of that web, in my mind.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying there's a chicken and egg problem, that the applications can't exist until the network's in place, and the network can't be justified until it's clear that the applications will justify the cost? Or
I think I think what you're seeing, I mean, you're already seeing people obviously experimenting and doing research and deploying autonomous vehicles at some level. And you're starting to see the challenges that come with that without the network. I mean, and so I think that's going to be really interesting. If you go beyond 16 autonomous vehicles with drivers in Pittsburgh to really something more than that, then you are going to have the network. And it may be the driver, though. But I guess where I think the real challenge is can you deploy autonomous vehicles without the network?
Yeah.
And in a real way.
And you mentioned in your opening comment that 5G, from your standpoint, from your member standpoint, I assume, is going to be a combination of some existing technology. So tell us a little bit more. How will 5G and LTE coexist or collaborate, replace each other? What's the migration?
But I think at the end of the day that LTE ultimately becomes part of the 5G mesh. And whether
playing any particular role?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think you're going to have, you'll have Bluetooth, you'll have Wi-Fi. You're going to be opportunistic. You're going to take advantage of new technology that enables, that will enable the user to move from technology to technology in a way. And I think that's going to be a factor that's going to help minimize the costs as well. I don't think it's about building a new network. I think it's about working on densification and continuing to build out the network we're building out for LTE.
Yeah. So this is different, right? I mean, in some sense, 4G really was a replacement for 3G, and 3G really was a replacement for 2G. This is a break in that sort of historical design, or maybe not.
I mean, that's my assessment. I'm not an engineer. I'm a lawyer. But based on what I hear from my members and from my staff, that's our expectation. Is it will be more of an evolution.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
It's an enabling technology, right? It's not a brand new network architecture. It is an opportunity to fully leverage the radio technologies that have already been deployed and to add new technologies into the mix that are essential to support the emerging use cases that an LTE network will have more difficulty with. Mm-hmm. And so there will be new radio technologies deployed. This is just sort of how we see it, right? Phase 1 would look like being timed for end of 2018. It'll be tied to 3GPP release 15. We'll look at ways that you can focus on new architecture for the core of the network and connectivity through the LTE radio that is out there now, fully leveraging the asset, giving use cases a little bit more time, and eventually evolving to a standalone. And then in phase 2, you start layering on new layers of architecture with hopefully 3GPP release 16 by the end of 2019. And so this is going to happen in waves and stages, but it's all designed around ultimate flexibility for the operator to pick and choose the existing radio technologies that meet needs in certain areas and to target where and when they will make the upgrades to new radio interfaces.
All right, so let's get down to brass tacks. How much is this going to cost? And I know it's not a question you can answer, and I'm asking you all to answer it anyway. What kind of scale is this going to be in terms of cost over, let's say the next 10 years? How do we get our hands around it? Do we have any idea at all? Let me start with you, Brian.
So, and preparing for the panel, we thought a little bit about this, and you have costs in a couple of different areas, right? You have spectrum acquisition costs. Some of the early phase 1 deployments are going to rely on spectrum below 6 gigahertz, which is going to rely on spectrum that's already been acquired or that will be acquired soon. Mm-hmm. So that will inject some cost. Obviously deploying full power base stations is more expensive than doing a huge rollout of small cells, to get you extra capacity. So it's hard to answer the cost question because it really comes down to the individual carrier customers' decision points about how and when they're going to deploy these technologies. But the good news is, I think, the FCC has been very aggressive and very comprehensive on its spectrum policy. They should be complimented for that. We had the Spectrum Frontiers decision in recent months that released a lot of high-band spectrum. This is key, right? Lower spectrum acquisition costs from a design perspective, more flexibility for operators to pick how to use those technologies to increase capacity. So all those things will help keep the costs down if everything's not requiring, that you participate in an auction to acquire new spectrum. But as I said, it's very much a work in progress with iterations between the carriers and the vendors about what are the power requirements, that you have, both from the machine, emissions, and power requirements to supply what the equipment needs to do. How do you shrink those costs?
Yeah.
And so it can be expensive, but it's hard to give you a dollar figure.
Okay, but you mentioned 3 things, and that's good because actually you talked about spectrum. Scott, what can you say about the infrastructure costs, and then what can you tell us about the operation costs?
Right. Well, I think from the infrastructure side, you're going to see continued investment. 5G is going to require both wireless and wireline investment in order to do small cells and to do the wireless stuff that you need to do in the urban settings. It's going to require more backhaul. So, like Brian, I can't give you a number. I think what you're going to see is continued investment. And you're seeing different ways of getting there. And what organizations like TIA have to do is to make sure that we work with the FCC and we work with Congress to make sure that they don't do anything that screws it up or that creates uncertainty. Because the more uncertainty you have, the less likely or the harder it is for the carriers to justify the investment.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to that, but let's talk about operating costs. What can we expect in terms of increases, decreases, CapEx versus OpEx? How's this going to play out?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're looking at, in the current business environment for carriers, you can already see a saturation of the subscriber base. You're already seeing a flatlining of their revenue profile and the ARPU that's being driven, which is causing a lot of the carriers to look at their internal operating structures to figure out how to optimize. And we are helping a lot of the carriers think through a new operating model for what they can do to take costs out of the current operations. And that's everything from real estate to power to site acquisition to all the things that are involved in the network deployment. We think that in the areas that we're looking at, there's hundreds of millions of dollars that you can take out of the operating costs associated with what they're doing today, both in upgrading the capacity of their network, net new deployments. How do you then take those savings and put them back into your investment streams as it relates to either CapEx investments or ongoing kind of operational improvements, right? Because as you think about 5G, what was good about wireless before was it provided a very lean, modern operating structure. As we move to 5G, there's a certain level of complexity that's introduced, and that's, just think about the number of bands that you're supporting. Think about the number of modes of operations that you have, whether it's just pure GSM or UMTS or LTE. We're going into 5G, and then you've got the ability to do network slicing. So, you've got the ability to kind of now have a virtual network that supports critical response times, or low frequency, high capacity, or high bandwidth, high frequency. And how do you manage the operational complexity associated with provisioning that type of network, monitoring that network from an operational capability, and then getting to those service level agreements that says, if you're going to be deploying very high critical applications that require sub-second or 0 seconds of latency, you need an end-to-end measurement of your operations capability to be able to do that and monitor that and heal that and automatically configure. So I think today what we're doing is driving the ability for operators to look at not only the organizational structure, the processes that are involved in deploying this network, how do we make that more efficient? But then secondly, how do we then take the ability of big data analytics to correlate a lot of these, the trouble tickets and the issues they're running into operationals, and be able to automate that to a point where then you start to require less resources to be able to do this.
Yeah, well, go ahead, Brian.
Just to add one point, and I'll preview another section of the panel.
Yes.
We're going to talk about on the policy side.
Don't give it all away.
No, I was just simply going to say that not every cost decision is fully within the control of industry. We talk a lot about densification for capacity, and densification requires deploying lots and lots of distributed antenna systems and small cells and getting access, state and local governments to give access to those sites. And what we find is probably 80+% of the actual cost associated with those deployments is not acquiring the radio technology, it's everything else that goes into getting permission and doing it. And 90+% of the actual cost is not related to the installation itself, it is all the other parts that go into getting permission and
You mean the lawyers, like
well, and lawyers too certainly play a role, although I am one, so I won't denigrate it too much. But look, just to add also, I think that the discussions between the vendor community and the carriers involve a lot of how do we make input changes, how do we virtualize functions that used to be placed in base stations at the edge of the network that maybe increase the operating costs of that technology over the long run, and make those things that are centralized or virtualized, or defined, software-defined radio. Those are big cost savings. You've seen them in LTE, you'll see them even more in 5G. At the same time, we're looking to ways to add more capability, performance, and value by doing things like mobile edge computing, by moving certain other things even further out into the network We're finding a lot of cases where, video, for example, is both acquired and consumed very locally, and so having a lot more capability in the base station. But you're always constantly making puts on power demands and things that drive the opex of that equipment against the backdrop of how do we continue to drive it down.
Okay.
Brian, I would add probably one more thing, sorry.
Go ahead. You go
I mean,
first.
the other thing that was interesting that, we haven't quite talked about, but it was brought up in the keynote with Chairman Wheeler is, there needs to be also the exploration of new partnership models, right?
Bingo.
As it relates, because we talk about the number of cell sites that need to be deployed. I mean, if we have 4+ carriers trying to do the same thing, I do think there's an opportunity here to start to look at network sharing, radio tower sharing. I mean, there's already, some of those are already in place, but I do think that, the competition should be less on kind of the network side of the equation, get it out there, but how do you then differentiate from a service experience perspective? So I think there's some creative opportunities here to start to share the cost across.
And your members probably have a point of view about this as well.
Well, we do. I mean, I think the other part I was going to say, not necessarily from my members' point of view, but from just generally, is you're going to also see new business opportunities. You've got a lot of real estate out there that's really valuable. You think about city departments of transportation and their traffic signals. That's great real estate for small cells. You think about, so can you transfer the cost there, or can you do a deal with the city? Think about buildings as they want to become smarter. They may be willing to make the investment to make sure that they get access to what they need. And so I think there are going to be these new creative business models that we're going to be taking advantage of as well.
All right. So let me play devil's advocate here for a moment. You all very beautifully dodged my question about cost, but I'm going to come back to it. So I'm a Wall Street analyst, and I haven't been around all that. I'm pretending to be one. Sorry. I've been around long enough that I remember the 4G investment, and the business case there was, I think, relatively straightforward one. We were out of capacity. We had all these new applications, all these new devices. It was clear that consumers wanted it and that we didn't have it. And so I think, relatively speaking, the investment on the capital side for 4G, for LTE, was an easier case, was a case to be made, and it was made, and obviously we see the results. We don't have that now. We don't have consumers saying, I want more and more and more bandwidth for applications that I have today, but that just aren't supported by the existing infrastructure. You're going to disagree right off the bat.
I do. I reject the premise of the question entirely.
Okay, go ahead.
I think that what we are seeing, whether the policy environment, and we'll get to that again, enables this or not is a different question. But there are opportunities. If you're just basically sell and offer the same consumer experience to consumers, I'd agree with the premise of your question. But I don't think that is envisioned at all. I believe there is a focus on the concept of a personalized network experience that gives you not just more capacity or a larger data bucket, but it's giving you an entirely different user experience. Part of that user experience will be enabling new technologies, and part of it will be getting a better use experience. If you're a gamer and you're having issues with your current network because your cell sector isn't performing or there isn't an insufficient amount of capacity available, we're talking about delivering an entirely new network experience to users.
All right, but I'm going to continue into my devil's advocate role. And so you told me a few minutes ago that those interesting applications were sometime in the future. You wouldn't tell me when they were, but now you want me to invest a lot of money now in building an infrastructure that will support those future applications. How can I justify that if I don't know when they're actually going to be deployable? In other words, you want me to spend money now for something in some future that's not quite determinable.
And again, I don't want to jump too far ahead into our policy discussion, but I would say that if we're not going to allow operators to monetize the data that is on their networks because we enact policies that heavily restrict their participation in the ecosystem, then you're probably correct. But the extent to which data analytics are a value driver with more and more data, more and more connectivity, more and more devices being made available, if they are allowed to participate and use that information to create value, That's not a current source of revenue that's driving a lot of their investment decisions, but we do have to stop doing foolish things through our regulatory apparatus that make it hard for carriers to monetize and participate in that ecosystem.
All right, we'll come back to them in a minute, but Tejas, from the standpoint of your practice, how do you see, how do you help carriers, for that matter, make the case to Wall Street that this is an investment that can be justified now to the extent they're asking for capital investment now?
Right, and I think our focus has been more on getting their current infrastructure more efficient, both from a deployment perspective as well as an operating model perspective. And if you think about what Brian also mentioned, I mean, as you think about it, this is a system of systems, right? So you need to be able to start to be more efficient on your existing network infrastructure, to be able to take the cash back, to make those other investments. So our focus has been more on how do you make the current network infrastructure that you're building out and continuously improving be more efficient, both in the deployment side and then on the operational side, right? So I think freeing up the ability to create a new operating model associated with how they drive their network operations is going to allow them to start making some decisions around where to put that money best to use, right? So our focus has been how do we get more efficiencies in the current network architecture.
And without going into a great deal of detail, what's the answer? What kinds of things are carriers doing to increase the efficiency?
I mean, I think it's so operating costs. So if you think about some of the big spend areas, there's a disconnect, as I said, between the cost structure and the revenue. If you look at their macro sites today, I mean, you know, we said there was about 200,000 macro sites in the US, each of the carriers having about 65 to 70,000. We don't see that growing more than 10% year over year over the next 5 years. But we do see that spend accelerating to a point of over 200, 300% as it relates to them adding additional capacity or moving to more of that small cell infrastructure, which today is a very small component of their overall network architecture. But as you get to the more of the densification and the need for moving from, let's say, 5,000 small cells to 70,000, that is an incremental investment that is huge in terms of scale for both the deployment side and the cost side. And so what we've been focused in on is how do you start to look at that deployment cycle, one, accelerate it, but two, do it in a manner that allows you to get cost efficiencies. Right.
And I'd say, I mean, you're seeing the carriers and the suppliers doing a couple of things right now. You're seeing network function virtualization, a lot of investment in that, and a lot of real activity, and you're seeing that deploying, and that's changing, obviously, the makeup of the network. You're also seeing a move to open software development, and that is changing the amount of investment that an individual company has to do. It's completely changing the way we do business, but it's taking a lot of costs out, sometimes to the detriment of my members who are used to selling proprietary hardware and proprietary software. That isn't the future. And so companies like Nokia and Ericsson are going through massive business transformations so that they can continue to be competitive and provide those services. But what we're seeing is the cost structure being driven, and it's getting harder and harder to make revenue because the carriers are doing such a good job and taking costs out right now.
You know, one other area we haven't really touched on as much, and Tejas has been talking a lot about efficiencies and operations of the business and taking costs out. I think one of the overarching themes for 5G, as the vendors see it, is providing the customer with flexibility on what solutions to deploy, and that includes investing heavily in new antenna technologies, which is not always the sexiest thing to talk about, but how do you get more out of the infrastructure that you already have deployed by deploying new multi-gain, multi-directional antennas that are capable of being flexible enough to increase spectral efficiency, which is a big thing, because we talk about spectrum acquisition is a very costly proposition. If you're not using the spectrum that you have as efficiently as possible, it heightens the need for additional spectrum. And that's a major long-term cost driver. So our focus is on trying to give the carriers as much flexibility as possible to get more out of what you have.
Right. I mean, the only thing I'll add is, as we talk about kind of taking costs out of the operational side and the deployment side, what we're seeing is about 20 to 25% cost takeout savings opportunities within these organizations, and that's,
And are you talking principally about very large carriers or smaller carriers or across the board?
I mean, I think it's largely we've been focused on some of the larger carriers,
okay.
right? But I think it depends on the type of network they have, the legacy environment that they've deployed, and how long they're hanging on to some of their legacy equipment, right? So I think it's a combination of historically, how long have they been? I mean, if it's a greenfield operator that started 15 years ago, they would have a completely different network architecture and a cost structure than somebody that's been in, has both a wireline business and a wireless business. So we see opportunities in consolidating what typically used to be siloed organizations, consumer, enterprise, wireline, wireless, all needing similar network backhaul infrastructure, but doing the planning cycles and the deployments completely independent. So, bringing all of that planning cycles together in a more efficient manner is going to allow them to leverage that same field force that's going out there to lay fiber for both the wireless organization as well as the wireline organization. So there's plenty of opportunities to drive efficiency, and this is not like $10 or $20 million of costs that we're taking out of an organization. It's hundreds of millions of dollars that we think can be taken out to become more efficient, to be able to then deploy to, new capital projects.
Okay.
And what happens with the big carriers ultimately rolls downhill.
That's right.
So I want to bring the audience in just a moment, but let me come back to you, Brian, because you've now hinted at it a couple times. Let's get this out in the open. So you mentioned new revenue sources and the idea, in particular, of monetization of data, but there's a policy problem. So tell us about that.
So there's a couple of policy impediments, not all of them federal in nature. I've already mentioned the infrastructure siting and deployment issues. We've had a lot of conversations. Just yesterday, we spoke with the city of Las Vegas as a place that can be a test or a demonstration case for how a smart infrastructure deployment policy can help make for early adoption and deployment. So I think there must be attention paid to that at state level, certainly, but if we continue to see the kinds of disparate and slow processes, perhaps there needs to be a federal model for streamlining that aspect. What I was really alluding to on the monetization side, though, is the extent to which we have seen the enactment of some policies, including the net neutrality decision that the Commission, the FCC made in 2015, which I think Nokia cautioned at the time was very short-sighted. It was driven by abstraction and ideology and less about thinking about how long-term value creation at every level of the ecosystem is essential to this moving forward. Innovation doesn't just happen at the edge of the network. It happens everywhere. It happens in the network. And so for entities to justify extraordinary investment, for me to justify extraordinary research and development costs into moving into this next space, the carriers who are going to do the deployment have to see a case where they will be able to participate in the Internet of Things and the massive increase of data. And the net neutrality decision, just as one example, took away all sorts of potential business models that included that personalized network experience for subscribers to be able to offer them a heightened service quality for certain applications for a fee. That was taken away ex ante. We have an open privacy proceeding at the FCC right now, which will apply only to broadband internet access service providers. And the outcome of that proceeding is unknown, but is expected to be resolved potentially within a month or so. If that enacts additional limitations on how carriers are able to participate in analytics and the use of information to create value, while at the same time others in the ecosystem are able to access and use that very same information, that has an impact on the value creation inside the carrier ecosystem. That goes directly to the question of, can they justify the investment? It's clear that just subscriber fees coming from end users, if that's the assumption moving forward, is going to make this economic case more difficult. So don't do foolish things is the message here. Let's think about value creation everywhere in the ecosystem.
Scott, I see you shaking your head. Do you want to weigh in on that or any other policy issues that we haven't touched on that are relevant?
Well, I think, the other thing that we really haven't talked about, and that I think is important, is particularly about the investment part, is the rest of the world is moving forward. You've got Korea, and you've got Japan, who are announcing 5G networks in 2018 and 2020. You've got Europe. And the United States has been in the lead in 2G, 3G, 4G. Do we want to give that up? And more importantly, do we want a standard that's based on a small island nation?
Yep.
You don't. We have unique needs in the United States and in the Americas that have got to be addressed. Okay. And so, I mean, part of the answer, and you're seeing the carriers, you're seeing the big suppliers really working aggressively in 3GPP and in the ITU to really move forward with a North American approach. Mm-hmm. And I think that's critically important.
Okay. Let me take some questions from the audience, if there are some. I've got a mic moving around, so if you just raise your hand. Yeah, over here. Hi, just tell us your name so we know who you are.
Yeah, sure. It's Matt Nicknam from Deutsche Bank. Just one cost item that I was curious about is...
Oh, so Wall Street.
Analyst,
okay.
Wall Street analyst, yeah. So you preempted me, but yeah. The costs around fiber backhaul, so fiber access, local fiber access is something that we're hearing a lot about in a 5G world. Just wondering how that plays into a carrier's decision-making process as they think about the economics of a 5G build.
Okay, good question.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, I think at least from a wireless perspective, I think the total cost that we're starting to look at is more on the operational side, right? I do think the capital investments required, and I think, Brian, you might have a perspective on this as we were talking earlier, that front haul, is that what you're talking about? Is that front haul, the last 100 meters? Sorry, more? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there's various ways to attack it right now. I think the current investments that they're making on just fiber to the home deployment or the last, I would say, 100 or 200 meters, I think it's fairly an efficient spend. I think where they're getting bogged down is in kind of the permits and the construction and the ability to kind of move faster at the same pace. So I think I don't think that's holding back a lot of the I think the cost structure issues around 5G, unless you move into more of the fixed wireless solutions that I think are being explored. There, I think then there's a significant kind of cost distribution issue.
Yeah, I think early on the discussions, I mean, you used to have very different cost drivers using the technologies. The fiber to the home doesn't have the power requirements, that you have with a wireless solution, but you need a fiber to every home. And so as we look at this, and one of the things that everyone in the vendor ecosystem is currently working on with carriers for the fixed local wireless solution is, again, the power requirements, the operating costs for that technology, and getting it down to where you have a real choice between technologies as a carrier about which things you're going to deploy where. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that's answering your question. I thought you were asking more about connectivity for backhaul for small cells and other things, which is a whole different question and a whole different challenge about how the three things you have to have for the densification. You have to have the access to the physical site and the ability to site it. You need power and you need connectivity. And there are some carriers that have more challenges when it comes to getting the connectivity for backhaul and what sorts of new solutions will be available to bypass some of the bottlenecks in the circuits that connect those kinds of small cells. I don't have an answer for you, but that is a definite cost decision that certain carriers who don't have those circuits will have to deal with, and they're looking at solutions to bypass that cost.
Thank you. Scott, did you want to weigh in? No. Okay. Other questions? I see in the back. Hang on, the mic's coming. And again, just let us know your name so we know who you are.
Sure. I'm Kent Lundgren, Pivotal Communications. We're holographic beamformers. My question is, do you think that, given the increasing data demand, that technology can keep consumer bills about the same as they are today?
That's a very good question, because consumers clearly don't want to pay more. In fact, they want to pay less as far as my survey of consumers go. Will we be able to do that in a 5G world?
Well, I mean, I hate to sound like a one-string banjo, but I think that presumes that you're selling them the same thing you're selling them now. And I think if that is the case, we're going to have some challenges. And I agree, people don't want to pay more for what they're currently getting, but I think the extent to which we enable flexible business models for the carriers to personalize the network experience, as an example, to consumers, you're going to find that consumers are willing to enter in at new price points and at the same time create valuations and perhaps even make wireless services for those who don't have such demands less expensive. So I see you could have a recalibration of price and entry points if we're creative about how we let the operators address it and give them something different in a user experience than what they've been getting to date.
Brian's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, Brian. I mean, I think it's going to be a challenge to get the consumer to pay more for something that they already have today.
Right.
But I think if you're developing an ecosystem where you're adding value, and that value is perceived as something critical to the end consumer, there I do think they're going to pay more. But it's the ability to have that flexible business model to be able to do that.
Good question. Thank you for that. Other questions? Yeah, I've got one over here, so you have to keep going back and forth. Thank you.
This question is about,
sorry,
my name is Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
From Intel. We make computer chips.
All right, we've heard of you.
The question is about licensed and unlicensed spectrum. So one of the challenges, of course, is to have the spectrum usable as globally as possible with a lot of countries involved. Economically, with unlicensed spectrum, you can't really make any money from selling the spectrum. With licensed spectrum, you can. So today, the way it's worked out with Wi-Fi, we have a good access system with no mobility built into it. With LTE and such, we have mobility built into it. Some of those, going forward, as you combine licensed and unlicensed spectrum and these technologies, do you see tension to try to move mobility into kind of the unlicensed Wi-Fi world, or do you see a tension to try to either expand or contract the unlicensed spectrum so you can get ROI for your investments?
I understand the question, although I haven't the slightest idea of the answer.
You just thrown us into the briar patch, and we could be here for hours.
No, we can be here for 2 minutes and 7 seconds.
Okay, very good, very complicated question, and it's one that's being fought out, particularly around licensed spectrum as we try to get squeeze more and more out of it. You see it with government held spectrum. You see it with 5.9. You see it. I think ultimately one of the key solutions is going to be sharing, and I think the real challenge that we're going to face with respect to sharing is sharing in a 5G environment where it requires where we have the latency and reliability requirements, and we haven't solved that yet. I think the company that does solve that is going to be pretty well situated going forward. But it is a very, very significant issue that's being played out at the FCC on a kind of a daily basis. And I know you asked the question because you know that. But I don't think there's an easy answer for it.
I mean, we know that the order set aside new 5G unlicensed spectrum as well as 5G licensed spectrum. So we know the FCC has at least in mind to continue the idea of unlicensed as a sandbox.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you, Scott, for just about filibustering to the end of the panel so we can get out of the briar patch a little faster. I guess I would just add this. I think both are essential and necessary. the premise, at least under which Nokia operates for 5G, is that there will be flexibility and to use the right technology in the right places. So clearly there's a role for unlicensed. I think we would probably tell you candidly, we think there has been too much of a focus on unlicensed. So we're hoping that moving forward, the decisions are based more on what is technically the right choice to make for a particular band, where it makes sense in the ecosystem, and less about just competing business priorities. Because I think you get too many of these half-loaf kind of orders where you had a great Spectrum Frontiers order, but some in the carrier community looked at it and said, but very little new licensed spectrum made available to me, so I'm not very happy with that order. It's a hard question for the FCC to solve. I'm glad I don't have to solve it, but we are better off when those decisions are made on technical grounds as opposed to competing business cases.
And by the way, you also made the point, we've got to stop, but you also made the point about how this fits in with harmonization internationally, which of course affects equipment costs quite dramatically, but we don't have time to talk about that.
Right.
So instead, we'll leave it for another day. I want to thank my esteemed panelists, and I want to thank you for some excellent questions. Thanks very much.